Folks, we continue our evidence taking on the sustainability of Scotland's finances with a roundtable discussion, and I therefore like to welcome to the meeting Adam Sakura, Head of Policy and Communications at Age Scotland, Dr Judith Turbine, Chief Executive, Children in Scotland, Philip White, Director, Institute of Public Policy Research Scotland, Stuart Hay, Director, Living Streets Scotland, Ruth Boyle, Policy and Campaigns Manager, the Poverty Alliance, Michael Kellett, Director of Strategy, Governance and Performance, Public Health Scotland, and Alistair Sim, Director of University Scotland. So I want to thank everyone for their written submissions. And the way we're going to do this is, rather than me ask a whole load of different questions, I'm only going to ask one question, which will be to you, Ruth, to kick us off. And then anyone who wants to comment on what Ruth has said, if they just let me know, and we'll just buzz around the table so that everyone gets the maximum opportunity to speak, and I will only come in as and when, i.e. not very often, which will satisfy John because he's always moaning about how much I speak at these events. Okay. So, Ruth, your submission, which is very detailed, an excellent submission, is called The Case for Fair Tax Reform in Scotland. And you will have heard some of what the economists before you've said, and what they basically talked about is, well, let's see what you've said first of all. You've talked about it's important that critical national priorities cannot be sacrificed due to a lack of funds. You've talked about new and improved forms of local taxation that target under-taxed wealth as well as business and polluters. You've called for a fundamental rethink from scratch of how income tax can best be designed. You've called for a cross-party process to replace the council tax. And you called for a local inheritance and local payroll tax. Now, one of the things that the economists said basically was that we have a small, finite group of people who pay a very high proportion of tax in Scotland, and they have real concerns about behavioural impact. For example, if we do decide to go down the road of increasing taxes significantly. So I'm wondering how you feel we can deliver what the Poverty Alliance wants to deliver in terms of its social policy, and how we can actually fund these, given the constraints that the economists presented to us in terms of not only the fiscal gap that the Scottish Government has just now, but the impact on higher taxpayers should some of these policies be implemented, i.e. they might leave Scotland, or they might decide to work less, basically, or they might have more avoidance. So, Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting the Poverty Alliance to give evidence today. I'm really pleased to be here. The reason that we are here is because we think that it's totally unjust that people would be experiencing poverty in a wealthy country like Scotland, yet right now we see that 250,000 of our children are currently living and having their life chances restricted by the injustice of preventable poverty. You're right that we think that key national priorities can't be sacrificed due to a lack of resources. We see in the latest scrutiny report from the Poverty and Inequality Commission that the investment in the actions in Best Start Bright Future haven't matched the ambition of those policies. Now, Philip and I are here today to represent more than 50 organisations who endorsed a briefing on using our tax powers progressively. And those 50 organisations have come together with a very simple message, and it's that to see the transformational change that we know is needed to meet our national priorities on poverty and the climate, we need to see transformational investment. And in the current economic and fiscal environment, we think that that necessitates a progressive use of Scotland's taxation powers. We know that Scotland has taken a more progressive approach to tax than the rest of the UK so far, but what we're calling for in our briefing is for the Scottish Government to go further and faster. We heard very stark modelling earlier today in terms of that £1.9 billion shortfall by 27-28. And that's going to put pressure on existing spending, never mind the additional resource that we know is necessary to meet those national priorities. Now, what that would mean if we don't take progressive action on tax will be further cuts. In the papers for the committee today, we see that local authorities are saying that all of the easy cuts have been made. And we see from the people and the community organisations that we work with day to day that that's absolutely the case. People are still dealing with the impact of over a decade of austerity, and we know that any further cuts are going to have a really tangible impact on their lives, particularly because in some cases that will mean cuts to statutory services. We've outlined a range of options in the paper today, which I'm sure Philip and I will be able to talk through over the course of the session. In the short term, we are outlining options to use our income tax powers more progressively. We
pointed that out. That what the economists have said, though, is that if you implement some of these policies, you will not actually get any more money, because the people will simply A, avoid it, B, work less hard, or C, will leave Scotland. So, for example, what they said was that when the top rate went up by 1 penny in the pound last year, 90% of that revenue was actually lost to behavioural change. So someone who might work 5 days a week will just say, do you know what, I'm just going to work 4 days a week because I'm not going to lose all this money to tax. Why should I work for that? So so it's one thing to say, oh, if we do X, we'll raise 500 million extra in tax, or whatever the figure would be. But if you're going to lose 90% of that, or possibly the opposite, actually end up losing, you implement 500 million in tax, but because of those changes you lose 600 million in tax, it doesn't deliver the changes that you, and I'm sure, well, everybody really wants to deliver. I think everybody wants to tackle poverty, and we want to have better paid jobs, etc., and more money for the health service. But how do we realistically fund that when the impact of behavioural change is so fundamental to doing that? How do we? You can raise tax as much as you like, but if the money goes elsewhere, how do you do that?
I think we see in the papers for today's committee, the Scottish Fiscal Commission have said that behavioural change is challenging to quantify. When we're putting forward progressive policy change, we do often see a slight backlash in terms of what might be the unintended consequences of it. We've seen that from policy changes from the national minimum wage, for example. I think when there were changes to non-dom status in 2017, there was a lot of concern that that would lead to a sort of mass exodus. When you look at analysis from the University of Warwick, that doesn't actually play out in terms of what happened. I think we need to be clear that there is a range of reasons why people choose to build their lives in Scotland. And I think that would move beyond simple tax powers. But also we need to make sure that if we are going to increase tax, that people feel the benefit of that taxation in terms of the local public services that they have and the opportunities that they have. When you look at polling, we would absolutely disagree that tax isn't popular. So we see polling from IPPR Scotland that shows that 60% of people support tax increases, even if it means their tax would go up if that was invested in our social safety net. Similarly, in the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, we see an increasing majority supporting this redistribution of wealth from those who are better off to least well off. And also, I think when we're talking about this, people working less, this is one of the fundamental issues with our tax system, is that it's overly reliant on income tax. So we rely on income tax to do much of the heavy lifting. And actually, one of the key points put forward in our briefing is that we need to shift the dial towards tackling and taxing wealth. That's a really untapped potential in terms of how we could raise the revenue, and that's why we've put forward other proposals around replacing the council tax with a property value tax or that local inheritance tax as well. So we shouldn't get solely focused on income tax, but instead be looking at this package of reform.
Tempted to come back in, but John to be followed by Michael.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, we have concentrated so far on how can we raise more tax for the existing expenditure, but and I'm sympathetic to that, but to be a little bit devil's advocate, are there areas of expenditure that we could cut back on? For example, is the Scottish social security system too generous compared to the UK? Because the previous panel told us that making up that difference is having an effect on other services. Linked to that is the Scottish Government has it got too many priorities? Should we be trying to simplify things, just a fewer of them? And what about the idea of, are we being too generous with giving, say, the bus pass to everybody? Should we be more means testing, targeting some of that expenditure?
What would you suggest?
The first point I wanted to come back on was the idea of the social security system being too generous. We'd push back on that in that I think the approach that the Scottish Government have taken to social security has been extremely welcome. We all rely on the social security safety net, but we know it's a vital lifeline for people who live on low incomes. When we look at the child poverty targets right now, as I said, we're not on track to meet those, but we know that the action that's been taken through the social security system, in particular the Scottish Child Payment, has done basically all of the heavy lifting in terms of helping us to get closer to those targets. So the Scottish Child Payment is expected to lift 90,000 children out of poverty, and we know that our members don't think that we've reached the end point of what we can do through the social security system in order to address poverty. I think on your point in terms of universalism versus targeting, I'm not going to sit here today and say that that is a simple debate, because it's absolutely not. But when we look at the pros and cons of universalism versus targeted, we know that universal services are really important in terms of overcoming the impact of poverty-related stigma. We know that that functions as a barrier to uptake. I'm sure Adam will be able to talk about that in the context of pension credit. We also see that functioning as a barrier in the context of free school meals. Targeting was a theme that emerged from the First Minister's Anti-Poverty Summit. But something that we would be concerned about is whether we have sufficient data, sufficient intersectional data in particular, to actually target resources and policies effectively. We know that there's tools within the budgetary process, so human rights budgeting and gender budget analysis, that help us to make sure that the budget is meeting the needs of those who need it most, but we're not routinely using those tools. The priority family approach is really important in the context of child poverty. 90% of children who experience poverty fall into at least one of those groups. But we don't have sufficient data about the experiences of poverty for those family groups, and we don't have sufficient data about how policies is meeting their needs.
To an extent, because it does help focus on this. A number of people, including economists that were here before, have talked about the 3-year funding, or perhaps 5 years, and obviously we know the Scottish Government isn't funded beyond year to year, but there's still an issue about whether or not we should plan. I mean, I have to say that I was in the Social Justice Committee in the 1990-2003 Parliament. We produced a detailed report on why we should do exactly what you've suggested. And 20 odd years later, we're still talking about it. So I think that is actually a fundamental point, although you haven't put pounds, shillings and pence on it. So I'm just wondering if, because you have got some statistical analysis in terms of your report, Ruth, whereby you've produced some wonderful graphs, etc., etc. So I was wondering if you can talk us through maybe in a few minutes, a few short minutes, what additional resources you think we should be, given all the caveats about wealth tax, it can't be implemented for the next financial year, etc., according to the economists, but what we could do in the next year in order to deliver the agenda that yourself and the IPPR and indeed some others would like to see.
Yeah, no problem. I would say that Philip next to me is the maths man, so I will let him speak through some of those tables. But I think that the things that we would be calling for in order to end poverty are, of course, costly, and we recognise that. Ahead of Challenge Poverty Week, which takes place between the 2nd and the 8th of October, and I'm sure is in everybody's diaries around this table, we've called for a series of policy changes around the minimum income guarantee, housing and transport, and we recognise that those are costly. I think picking up on Adam's points about the fair funding for the third sector, that's another one of our key calls this year. As you say, Convener, that's a long-standing call from the Scottish Government to actually recognise the value of the third sector with multi-year funding awards that are fair and sustainable. We would echo SCVO's calls around fair funding and think that that's really important, particularly because during the cost of living crisis, we know that some of our community-based membership have really been at the front line of efforts to tackle poverty, and we think that they should be recognised with fair funding. But current trackers from SCVO show that around 2/3 of the third sector are facing financial challenges. I think for us, we have looked at the modelling in terms of what we could raise with the changes that we are proposing around tax. Of course, these are just options, but looking at setting that higher rate of income tax, that new tax band, could raise between £110 and £260 million, depending on where you set that. Obviously, in the longer term, around £300 million from setting that inheritance tax at the local level.
First figures assuming no behavioural impact, is it?
Yes, I presume in the modelling we have not accounted for behavioural impact, but I'm sure that Philip is able to come back on that as well. And also £350 million from looking at changes to council tax as well. I think for us, it's also not solely about new money, but also thinking about the way in which that we approach the budget process. I've already highlighted things like human rights budgeting and a gender budget analysis. And when we're in economic crisis and when budgets are particularly tight, it's even more important that that we are undertaking those analyses to make sure that we are making the most of the resources that we have. I really like the turn of phrase that the Alliance used in their contribution around human rights being the golden thread that runs through everything that the Parliament does. And it's really important that when committees are undertaking their budget scrutiny, that we're not thinking that equality budget analysis or human rights budget analysis should only take place in the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. That should be a priority for all of the committees. And that's really one of the key ways in which we can make sure that we're maximising our resources when we are in a very tight fiscal environment.
Ruth.
I think, first of all, that we would reiterate the comments that are made every time we get to budget scrutiny around the importance of transparency, the changes to allow us to look at how spending is changing over years, doing year-on-year comparison. All of that is really important. But I would urge the committee, as you take forward your pre-budget scrutiny, to think about ensuring that you continue to place that emphasis on poverty. We know that 21% of our population lives in poverty. That rises to 24% for children. And I think it's easy to become numb to those statistics, but actually we know that that has far-reaching negative consequences for people's lives. During the cost of living crisis, we've heard from women that are going without food themselves in order to feed their children. We've seen the impact of poverty in the recent statistics around suicide deaths, around alcohol-related deaths, and also child homelessness. We know that people in Scotland believe in justice and compassion, and we really want to see those shared values being turned into concrete action to tackle poverty. So we have cross-party support for those child poverty targets, and it's vital that we meet them and that those are not sacrificed. And also, in the longer term, tackling poverty and inequality is good for economic growth. And that's not just organisations that are in the anti-poverty sector or the equality sector that say that. That also comes from institutions like the IMF. I think in this climate, the spending that we've all called for today necessitates us to look at our tax system and how Scotland can use their powers progressively. Our paper sets out a range of options, and I think what we really want to come from the publication of that paper is that we see a serious conversation about how we could take forward some of those options.
Okay, thank you. Alistair.